On May 2nd, get ready to escape. Isis, Escape from Transylvania. The goddess next door and John Haynes must escape a horde of vampires on the hunt in this horror-filled Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Escape from Transylvania in paperback and e-readers this May 2nd. A couple of days ago, I did a video talking about John Diggle's nigger moment on the CW's Arrow. And in order to understand what happened to John Diggle on the CW's Arrow, you have to understand the concept of the house slave. Now, there's a reason why I call John Diggle the butler on the CW's Arrow, because John Diggle is just like the house slave. And usually, house slaves were the butler to the slave master. And because they were the butler to the slave master, they usually wound up following behind him everywhere he went inside of the manor. So the house slave would be the first one, the butler would be the first one to prepare the master's clothes. He would be the one to prepare the master's food. And in many cases, when the slave master got new clothes, like new shoes, he was usually the guy to wear the shoes first because he was the one to break the shoes in so that the shoes would be comfortable for the slave master. And because the house slave was someone that the slave master trusted, the house slave often thought he was in a prime position. Unfortunately, the big problem with the house slave is that he didn't understand he was a slave. And no matter what position he had, whether it be in the house or in the field, he was always submitting to the authority of the slave master. And when it came down to John Diggle thought because he was Oliver Queen's number two, he thought he had a prominent position, just like the house slave thought he had a prominent position, one where he was doing what he thought were easier labors, and something that he thought he had was the slave master's trust. Because in addition to being able to wear better clothes, like that butler uniform he had, and wear the slave master's new shoes, your butlers oftentimes had trust of the slave master over his money, and in some cases even did business by proxy for the slave master. That meant that the slave master oftentimes would send out the butler or the house slave to go do business transactions for him. And I saw that dynamic transpiring on season 6 of Arrow, because when it came down to the Spartan character, John Diggle, he was the house slave. And Oliver Queen, who was overwhelmed in his duties as the mayor of Star City and taking care of his son, decided that being the Green Arrow was a little too much for him, and he wanted to focus on his business. And because he wanted to focus on his business, he got his old trusted house slave, John Diggle, to go be the Green Arrow. And he was the Green Arrow for a while, but when the slave master saw that his trusted servant could not handle the duties given to him, he decided to resume being the Green Arrow. Now, the big problem with your John Diggle was, like many house slaves, he thought that the power given to him meant that he was some sort of equal. And he thought because the slave master trusted him that he would be able to be on the same level as the slave master, Oliver Queen. That's what he thought, and that's what happened when he decided to go ask for the hood of the Green Arrow back. He thought, oh, I made a mistake, things are a little bit better, and he will give me another opportunity to resume being the Green Arrow and having that position that is on the same level as he is. And what he was doing was showing how weak he actually was, because when it came down to John Diggle, again, as I stated in my previous video, his biggest mistake was believing that he could come from the position of submission to a position of authority. And it just doesn't work like that. He wanted to be the Green Arrow on Oliver Queen's terms, and that's why he was begging to get the hood back. And when Oliver Queen told John Diggle that the Green Arrow allowed him to be the best version of himself, basically he was explaining in a white supremacist statement that this hood allows me to be the best white man I can be, and this is why I cannot allow you to have this position. And because when he actually gave him that position, he proved to him that he could not handle the responsibilities. Because your John Diggle, when he, instead of admitting that he had this injury and saying no, he just took the position and then messed up. And then the other slaves, like your wild dog, he went under the table and told on him, which pretty much showed how little respect those slaves had for John Diggle. So when it came down to John Diggle, he thought he was in a prominent position, but he didn't understand that he had no real authority as a man. And this was the big problem with him overall, because again, he was coming to be a hero on Oliver Queen's terms, and that was always the big problem with your John Diggle, because he started out on Arrow always following behind Oliver Queen. It was his suggestion that he become the Spartan hero, because he was usually fighting crime right at his side in his regular street clothes, and then he decided to become a hero because Oliver Queen asked him to be a hero. He never was a hero on his own terms or fighting for his own cause. And this was all due to him having a slave mentality, like many house slaves and many field slaves out that are still out here in the black community, still believing that they have to do things on white supremacy's terms. And because they believe they have to do things on white supremacy's terms, they usually wind up falling far short, because they are trying to fight by a white man's standards and not their own, and they're fighting for a white man's mission and not their own. And that's what happened to John Diggle, and that's why he wound up so angry in that episode of Arrow. And that's why he had that N-word moment, because he finally realized how little value his life was to Oliver Queen, his slave master. Because when it comes down to many of these Negroes out here, they often believe that their work has some sort of value, their sacrifices have some sort of value to these white people, not understanding that these white people in many cases just use the Negro as a tool to advance themselves, and then once they have gone where they want to go, they no longer have need of you. And you had John Diggle sitting there talking about Oliver Queen's ineffective leadership and the mistakes he made, when Oliver Queen had been making mistakes ever since season 1. It just took him 6 seasons to take a red pill and see the harsh reality as related to his position as a black man, and to see that he was Oliver Queen's house slave, his trusted butler, and when given this responsibility of wearing his hand-me-down costume that he had farted in, what had happened is he had failed to meet Oliver Queen's standards for the Green Arrow. But he was passive-aggressively, as I see it, set up, because when it comes down to John Diggle, he was never qualified to be the Green Arrow, and this was a way of showing him that he could never be on the same level as Oliver Queen. That's where the racism really lied in that whole John Diggle being the Green Arrow story arc, was that this man never really had the skills. Even if he had 2 healthy arms at the first episode, he did not have the archery skills to shoot arrows, nor did he have the dedication to the mission of protecting Star City, because he did not go through the same struggle as Oliver Queen. It's almost similar to Miles Morales and Peter Parker. Peter Parker's mission was forged by the "with great power comes great responsibility" and the death of Uncle Ben, whereas there is no substance to Miles Morales' story, because it just doesn't have any sort of tragedy to really make this character focus on his mission. And when you look at John Diggle, again, he was never a hero to be a hero on his own terms. He was a hero on someone else's terms. And when they decided to move the goalpost and change the deal, that's when he became the angry black man and became deeply frustrated about things because he thought he could elevate himself with this position and he thought he could be the hero on Oliver Queen's terms and he thought Oliver Queen would see him as an equal when the big problem again had to do with John Diggle's perception of self, and because he didn't see himself as an equal, he didn't want to make himself be the best version of himself. In order for a black man to see his own value and his own worth, he has to see himself as being worthy of something and see himself as someone deserving the very best and someone who aspires to be the best version of himself for himself and go out here to achieve for himself. He cannot go out here looking for social acceptance from others. He has to go out here and go to achieve what he wants to achieve for himself. But when I look at your John Diggle again, I saw the whole dynamic of what happens to the house slave because the house slave believes that he is the superior Negro because the white man has let him live in the house, he has let him put on these nice clothes, and sometimes he lets him put on his old clothes, and then sometimes he lets him put on his old shoes, and sometimes he lets him break in his new shoes. He trusts him with his money, he sends him out on his errands, he sends him to go do business for him, and he believes that he has this prominent position, but at the end of the day, he is always an N-word, just like the field slave in the eyes of this white slave master, because at the end of the day, both the house slave and the field slave are still slaves. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications, which feature positive presentations of African Americans, like the ISIS series, the Esteem series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to help me make more videos like this and pay for book covers for SJS Direct publications, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.